Well, hello, hey, welcome back. So this is part 3. Will I do another part? Will I continue on into America? And some may have asked about, Hitler and Bonhoeffer. We're looking at Christians in resistance against the government, civil disobedience. And so this is just a 3-part series. Maybe later, after Christmas, we'll look at a 4th or a 5th, either going back into church history or more to the modern day. But in the first one, we focused on Luther. In the second one, the French Protestant leaders. And now here in the third video, we're going to talk about what happened in England and how this sort of led to the ideas that helped found America, because the English did take a little bit of a more radical turn than their the continental theologians. So a little context, Henry VIII, he broke with the Pope, and kind of, I think it's an exaggeration to say he started Protestantism here in England or in Britain. It was kind of broke from the church, but it broke from the Pope, but it was still largely Catholic in its way it worshipped. It was only with his son, Edward, that really you see Protestant ideas coming in, and you have Thomas Cranmer really being the archbishop that helped leave his Protestant stamp on the Church of England. Now, unfortunately, Edward died. He died, well, I say unfortunately because I'm a Protestant, but he died young. And then Mary Tudor came, and she was a reactionary Catholic. And so she started persecuting the Protestants. And this is when Thomas Cranmer was killed. He was, I believe he was burned at the stake right there in London. If my memory serves me correctly. But many Protestants fled. They went down to the continent. They found refuge in Strasbourg and Geneva. And many of the Protestant leaders who had been, church leaders during the time of Edward, they were now in exile. And they were reflecting, and they were writing theology, and they were writing books and trying to get them back into England to still influence things. By the way, if you're interested in this sort of videos, please like and subscribe, and you'll be getting more and more will pop up in your newsfeed. So I'd love for you to follow the channel. But so what happened was that some of Thomas Cranmer's boys, if you will, people he helped influence and disciple, these were bishops, these were like Oxford professors. They were writing some really good stuff while they were in exile. One guy, his name was Poinet, and Poinet, he took on a lot of the ideas that the French reformers had about how civil disobedience worked. He believed that there was a time when a monarch becomes a tyrant, and therefore you're no longer bound by conscience to support them. And this question, the Poinet argued, when does a legitimate king become an illegitimate tyrant, and that moral people, good people, can disobey them? He wrestled with this question in his works, and this went on to influence some of the founding fathers in America, particularly John Adams. When is it a tyrant? When is it a Christian right and even a Christian duty to disobey a tyrant? And that's a hard question to answer. Let's be honest. Like, when is that line crossed between just, here's a ruler I don't like his policies or her policies. I didn't vote for them. The popular hashtag in America is not my president. Democrats use that for Trump, and now some Republicans are using it for Biden. When does it go from just that, I don't like their policies, I don't like them, to this person is actually an illegitimate tyrant? Not all Christians will necessarily agree on that, and Poinet wrestles in his book on that. Big influence on some of the American founding fathers, particularly John Adams, who was a very strong Christian. Another guy was Goodman. Goodman, I believe, had been a professor of divinity. Maybe he was professor at Oxford, I think, professor of divinity, and he wrestled with the exegesis for Romans 13. Which is, you need to submit to the authorities that be. He argued, and this is where the English become more radical than the continental reformers. So Luther and all the magisterial reformers, up till now I've been talking about what's called the magisterial reformers, Luther and Calvin and these guys. There was also another branch of the Reformation called the radical reformers. These were, usually equated with the Anabaptists. One of the more radical ones being Thomas Munzer, where they were very anti-government, and they all lived in community, and they were waiting for the New Jerusalem. And the magisterial reformers wanted to work with legitimate government and, have a good, healthy relationship with church and state, and the two work together. And the Anabaptists were just like, screw the whole system. We're not going to have anything to do with them. The government's evil. It was a hyper Augustine, not just an Augustinian view, but a hyper Augustinian view that it is the whole government system is just all evil. And usually what happens is you have charismatic preachers like Thomas Munzer end up becoming not just spiritual leaders, but they form communes and they become kind of quite, in his case at least, a bit dictatorial, like in how policies should work. The church leaders almost become civil leaders within this community. And in my own opinion, that was pretty unhealthy. But they were all for revolution, for tearing down the social hierarchy, for leveling the playing field. And so generally Luther and the magisterial reformers and Calvin, they wanted to avoid all that. And they wanted a healthy relationship with a government. They wanted a government they could work with. And so they were always insistent on supporting lesser magistrates. And we talked about this more in the first two videos, support the lesser magistrates, the nobles, the mayors, the sheriffs, whoever, the people within the civil system, the public servants. So if the king or the prime minister, the president, if they're corrupt, if they're tyrannical, we'll support a lesser magistrate to replace them. But we still try to work within the system. It was Goodman who said, well, addressed the question, but what if there are none? What if there are no lesser magistrates that have the courage to resist the upper magistrate? This happens a lot. You have sheriffs, you have local mayors. They're afraid to resist the prime minister, the president, the king, whoever is at the top. They're, the top magistrates not doing their job, but the lesser magistrates are too afraid to oppose them. It will mean their job. It could mean their life, depending on the system. And there's just, what should good Christian people do? It was Goodman who first articulated, and this is just not a nobody. This was the divinity professor from Oxford, trained by Cranmer. This was there's some big academic chops behind this guy. He argued, and you'd have to read his own work and how he got to the conclusion, but he argued if there are no lesser magistrates, it's preferable to do it through the lesser magistrates, but if there are none, then the people can rise up and dispose of and get for themselves new leaders. And this was a big change. This was actually a pretty radical change in thinking, and it did affect the Americans. It did affect the American Revolution. What if the whole system, the upper magistrates going right through the lower magistrates, what if they have also become corrupted and are tyrannical? Now, it's Goodman who says, I'm just going to look down at this quote. It says, to obey a tyrant is to rebel against God. So for a Christian, to obey a tyrant is to rebel against God. Well, that's a loaded phrase. I'll let you pray about that and think to what degree that's true or false in light of Scripture. But this was his main point. If you're obeying and submitting to a tyrant who's hurting people, who's punishing, Romans 13, and his exegesis of Romans 13 was, we have these lawful leaders who are put there by God to protect and uphold the good and then to punish the bad. But but a tyrant, he does the opposite. He punishes the good and rewards the bad. In that case, it is actually a Christian duty to resist such a leader. So he argues that not only can a Christian disobey a tyrant, a Christian should disobey a tyrant. At this time, the time, and once again, these affected the American thinkers. So at this time, what you have in reaction to this, particularly in the Catholic circles, is called absolutism, absolute monarchs or divine right monarchs. Now, I'm not going to get all anti-Catholic here because up till now in history, Catholic thinkers did not think of the king or the ruler as having absolute authority. You go back to the Middle Ages, no, it was understood that they had a limited authority and they should not overstep their limits, and there should be balances in check when the government gets too big. But in reaction to these Protestants, in reaction to the Protestant movement and thinkers, many Catholic thinkers adopted this more absolute version, that authority goes from God to the king, and the king is sort of God's representative on earth, and to disobey a king is to disobey God. So many Catholics adopted this view. Well, again, pointed out that's not historically the Catholic view. Okay, that was a reactionary view to Protestantism, and this became key. Where does authority come from? The Protestants were arguing that authority comes from God to the people, and then the people delegate that to the ruler, but with limits, with conditions, and if they break those conditions, it can be revoked. this would be something that would be argued for another 100 years or more. And Louis XIV, of course, was very famous in France up to the Revolution for being the sun god, the absolute monarch, believing himself to be the kind of the almost God on earth, and that everyone should to submit to him, and to disobey him was to disobey God. So this became a popular intellectual movement in Catholic circles. Samuel Rutherford was one last guy I want to mention, because he had a lot of influence on both within England. Made a difference in English common law, as well as going over, and his writings influenced the founding fathers of America as well. He made an important distinction between person and office. Once again, he wasn't a radical. He wasn't a revolutionary. He didn't want to tear down the system. He didn't want to burn it all. So he made a distinction between the person of the king, or the prime minister, whoever, the office and the person. And that when people rebel against a tyrant, they're not rebelling against the office of the king. They're okay with having a king. They just don't want this person to be king. So God might establish a certain government for an area, and that could be a republic, that could be a monarchy, whatever. But when that person acts tyrannical, the people aren't rebelling against a king as such. They're rebelling against that person being king. So just for example, here in England at the moment, people who think that the Boris Johnson regime at the moment and his dictates, if Christians were to rebel against that, Samuel Rutherford would say, don't rebel against the system. Don't rebel against the idea of having a prime minister, or, in America you have governors and presidents. Keep the system, keep the office. The authority is vested not in the person, but in the office. And so we rise up not to do away with the office, but just to remove that person and put in a good person. This thinking, this distinction between office and person would have huge political implications for those who wanted to fight tyranny, for those conscientious objectors, and they'd be able to say, I am not against the king, I am not against the queen, I'm not against the president, I'm not against I'm just against this person's and this person's decisions in that office. I'm all for submitting to the prime minister, just not this person as prime minister or president or king or whatever it would be. And one of the things, the texts he argued, which I don't know that any other reformer had touched on before. This was Jonathan. You remember when King Saul, Jonathan had disobeyed something King Saul said, and King Saul said, Jonathan must die. So the king says he must die. Now, what did the people do? Did they cite Romans 13? Well, yes, I know Romans 13 was written by Paul, and that came 1,000 years later. But did they just say, hey, well, the king has divine rights, and we must obey the king and submit to the king, and if the king says execute Jonathan, we should execute Jonathan? No, there was a moral justice saying, no, Jonathan hasn't done anything wrong. And they rebelled, and they saved Jonathan. There was this movement. Now, they didn't dispose of Saul as such, but there was a civil disobedience on the part of the people to rescue Jonathan from Saul. And so he argued there's a time for civil disobedience to the leaders. And he went through the Old Testament, made a lot of this use, particularly of the Saul and Jonathan episode. Okay, this is the end of the 3 videos. Look forward to, please leave comments. Love to hear your feedback, like and subscribe if you haven't. And again, the book, The Girl and the Guardian, does touch a little bit, it does touch on this with the whole person of Mordecai. He supports the king, but he refuses to bow to the viceroy. And as Christians, we need that discernment to be able to support and uphold legitimate authority and not be anarchists and revolutionaries, but also to know when to not bow and to disobey and to be conscientious objectors and say, these laws that you're passing, they're wrong, and we're not going to go along with it. This is not why we elected you. This is not why we put you in office. God, the authority comes from God to the people, and then people delegate some of that to leaders for certain conditions to do certain things. And if they break that trust, if they break that covenant, their authority is revoked. And this has been the thinking historically of Protestant thinkers. In the first video, we touched just very briefly on Augustine and Aquinas as well. Catholic thinkers, maybe in a future video, we'll touch on the Catholics or even more modern day thinkers as well. But that's all for now. Leave your comments. Love to hear what you think. Like and subscribe. And love for you to check out. It's a fantasy fiction book on Esther and Mordecai, but it's very theologically charged. So love for you to check it out. I'll put the link in the comments below. God bless and have a happy Christmas.